in a language of your choice. And if you didn't get a Bible the first time round and you would like one, please just put up your hand and one will be brought to you. As Sam explained, we're beginning a new series in the book of Hebrews. This morning we're going to have an introduction to it. So we won't be looking at a specific passage as such, but rather an overview of Hebrews. But it'd be helpful to have the book open in front of you. So if you turn back to page 1001, page 1001, that would take you through to the book of Hebrews. And I don't have any sermon such prizes to give out this morning. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. He's better than the Old Testament prophets. He's better than the angels. He's better than Moses. He's better than Joshua. He's a better high priest than Aaron and the Levitical priesthood. The new covenant that he is a mediator of is better than the old covenant. He has entered a better tabernacle. He provides a better hope. His sacrifice is better than the Old Testament sacrifices, and his blood speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. Jesus is better. And 13 times the Greek word translated better or more excellent occurs in the letter to the Hebrews. He's better than anything in the Old Testament that the readers of this letter were tempted to go back to. And he's better than anything that you and I are tempted to return to or be distracted by. Jesus is better. And that is the main theme of the letter to the Hebrews. And I'm really looking forward to us starting to study this letter as we begin over the next 3 months looking at the first section. And this morning is a brief introduction to it. So as I explained, we're not going to be looking at a specific passage from Hebrews this morning. We're going to be asking ourselves a number of questions, and hopefully the answers will help to lay the foundation of that we will build on as we study the letter together. So the first question we're going to ask this morning is, who wrote the letter to the Hebrews? Who is the author to the letter to the Hebrews? And the very short answer is, we have no idea. We just don't know who wrote this letter. There's no introductory greeting at the start of the letter, as you can see, as there would normally be. Normally in the introductory greeting of a letter, you're given the author's name, and given the fact that there's no introductory greeting, we're not told specifically, we're not given a name as to who the author was. In chapter 11 and verse 32, when the author refers to themselves, the word that is used is masculine in gender. So it's almost certain that it was a man who wrote the letter. So I think that rules out Priscilla as the author, which some people suggest. Others have suggested Paul is the author, and in the early church, in the first few hundred years, there was quite a conflict in the early church. Some thought that Paul did write it, some thought that he didn't write it. The author clearly knows Timothy. We see that in chapter 13 and verse 23, and of course Paul did know Timothy well. However, for me personally, I'm not convinced that Paul wrote it. Others have suggested Luke, others Barnabas, others Apollos. We simply just don't know. It's likely that whoever did write the letter had enjoyed a good education, because the Greek of the letter, it's more refined and polished than most of the other, if not the rest of the whole of the New Testament. They clearly knew the Old Testament extremely well, because Hebrews is constantly referring back to the Old Testament and making arguments from it. They clearly knew the book of Leviticus extremely well. To understand the letter to the Hebrews, you need to be very familiar with the book of Leviticus. Because much of the arguments that are made in this letter, they're based on the things which are talked about in the book of Leviticus. Significantly, I think, you'll see in chapter 2 and verse 3 that the author of the letter was a second-generation Christian. Second generation in that they didn't hear the gospel from Jesus himself, but they did hear the gospel from those who had heard it from Jesus. And so, of course, if the author was Paul, then that would seem to contradict what Paul says in Galatians 1, where he says that he didn't receive the gospel from men, but by revelation from Jesus. And there are other things to think through when thinking through who the author might be. But at the end of the day, we don't know who wrote it, and in many ways it doesn't really matter. Now, who is the letter written to? Who are the recipients of the letter? And again, we don't really know. Of course, we don't have this introductory greeting when normally the author would give his name and he would also address the people that he's writing to. But we don't have this introductory greeting, so we're not told specifically who the letter was sent to. Having said that, the letter does have a title, the letter to the Hebrews. This title is not part of the original scriptures, but it is found in the earliest form of the letter that has been passed down to us. And so given the author's obvious aim in the letter, which is to persuade the recipients not to return to the religious life that they'd lived under the old Mosaic covenant, and given that the term Gentile is not found in the letter, it seems very clear that the letter was written to Jews who had become Christians. It's likely that these Jews were Greek-speaking Jews. Why do I say that? Well, the author consistently quotes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament rather than the original Hebrew scriptures. It also seems very clear that the author is writing to a specific group of Jewish Christians rather than writing to Jewish Christians in general. Why do I say that? Well, because in chapter 10 and verses 32 to 34, he clearly knows some of the specific details of what is going on in their lives. At the end of the letter in chapter 13, there is a geographical reference which is some help to us. You will have noticed when we read the end of chapter 13 that he says, "Those who come from Italy send you greetings." So it could be that the author is living outside of Italy and he's writing to Jewish Christians who are living in Italy. And the Italian friends of the author that are with him, they are sending their greetings back home. And a good number of people think that he is writing to Jewish Christians who are living in Rome. But we don't know that for certain. What does seem clear is he's writing to Jewish Christians. And again, that's all that is important to know. When was the letter written? When was the letter written? What kind of date was it written by? Well, it can't have been any later than AD 96. Why do I say that? Well, because a man called Clement, who was the Bishop of Rome, he refers to it in one of his letters that he wrote round about AD 96. So he referred to this letter to the Hebrews. So very clearly, by about AD 96, the letter to the Hebrews was well known to the church in Rome. Now, there are some kind of vague time markers and references in the letter. So, for example, from the reference to Timothy in chapter 13, it must have been written during Timothy's lifetime. He was alive when the letter was written. In chapter 2 and verse 3, the author refers to how the recipients, as well as himself, are those who didn't hear the gospel from Jesus, but from those who did. So that's another vague time reference. If you were to look at the end of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, you will see that the author says that these Christians, these Jewish Christians, they should be much more mature in their faith than they are. So these Jewish Christians, they're not brand new Christians. It's not that they've just become Christians. They should be more mature than they are. So again, that's another kind of a time reference and marker. They've been Christians for a while. In chapter 13, he tells them to remember the faith and the way of life of the leaders that they've had. So presumably, this group of Jewish Christians, that they've been together long enough for some of their leaders to have died. So clearly, these people, they've been Christians for a while, which suggests that the date when it was written is not a very early date. It's a later date. Having said that, some suggest that it was written before AD 64. Why do they say that? Well, in AD 64, Nero started to violently persecute the church in Rome. And the persecution that this letter describes doesn't seem as bad as what we know that those Christians went through in Rome in AD 64 and onwards. But there again, of course, if the church was outside of Rome, then it could have been written after AD 64. What is very clear from the letter, however, and it's worth hanging on to this, what is very clear from the letter is that at the time of writing, the Old Testament sacrifices were still being made at the temple, and the Old Testament priests were still serving at the temple. So I think we can say with some certainty that the letter was written before AD 70, because in AD 70, the temple was destroyed. So the letter is not early, but it was written before AD 70. What is the purpose of the letter? What is the purpose of the letter? The purpose of this letter is to both encourage and warn these Jewish Christians not to go back, and not to go back to their former ways and to the religious life that they'd lived under the old Mosaic covenant. If you look in chapter 10 and in verses 32 to 34, we learn that these Christians, they had started really well. When they first became Christians, they really went for it. And they were even willing to suffer for their faith. They were willing to be publicly shamed for being Christians. They openly identified with Christians who had been imprisoned for their faith. They joyfully accepted their property being confiscated and stolen because they knew that they had a better and lasting possession. And yet now they are tempted to go back to their former way of life. Why? Well, one reason could have been because Judaism enjoyed the protection of Roman law. Judaism was one of those religions that was permitted by Rome, and so as the persecution of the Christians intensified and heated up, the temptation for converted Jews to go back to the synagogue and to go back to their former lives and to go back to Judaism must have been very real. It was safer physically. And so you think of conversations that must have taken place between parents as they said to each other, look how dangerous it's getting to be a Christian. Maybe we should go back for the sake of our children. Another reason why they could have been tempted to go back is because religious life under the old Mosaic covenant, it would have seemed much more impressive than Christianity. You see, under the old Mosaic covenant, they had things that you could touch and things that you could see. You had a physical temple that you could go to. You had an actual high priest that you could see in front of you that represented you before God. You had physical animal sacrifices that you could make to God, and visually and physically it would have been much more impressive than Christianity. And so all the way through, what this letter does is it shows these people how much better Jesus is than what they are tempted to go back to. And so it shows that he's better than the Old Testament prophets, and he's better than the angels, and he's better than Moses, and he's better than Joshua. And he's a better high priest than Aaron and the Levitical priesthood. And the new covenant that he is a mediator of is better than the old covenant. And he's entered a better tabernacle, and he provides a better hope. And his sacrifice is better than the Old Testament sacrifices. And his blood speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. Jesus is better, the writer is saying. All these Old Testament things, they are just shadows and copies of the real thing. That's the kind of language that this letter uses. I think the word shadows and the description of shadows, that's a great word. That's a great description to describe the things of the Old Testament. A shadow is something that gives you a general outline of an object, but the outline is not very clear and it's not the real thing. And the Old Testament rituals and sacrifices and so on, they were just shadows that Jesus cast back into the Old Testament. And they give you an outline of Jesus, but they are not Jesus. And so why would you want to go back to the shadows when you've got the real thing? Now you think about modern cars with their power steering and their updated suspension systems and their GPS. And if you're old enough, you think back to cars of the past with the manual choke and the bumpier ride. And when you wanted to do a 3-point turn because you haven't got power steering, you almost needed to do a warm-up before you did it. And so why would you want to go back to that? You think of houses with their modern day appliances, with ovens and air fryers and fridges and freezers and washing machines and tumble dryers and dishwashers and central heating and hot water from the taps and so on. And then you think back to life in the past where you had to wash your clothes in a river and cook over an open fire and live in a hut. And you say, well, why would you want to go back to that? And the writer's saying, well, why do you want to go back? Why, when you've got the superior, do you want to go back to the inferior? And even more than that, what the writer is saying is not so much, it's not just about returning back to what is inferior. It's about the danger of turning away from Christ. It's about the danger of turning away from Jesus, in whom all these things were fulfilled. It's about the danger of turning away from the great salvation that all these things were pointing forward to. And so the writer keeps saying things like, don't drift away from what you've heard. And don't neglect so great a salvation. And don't harden your hearts. And don't fail to enter God's rest. And don't fall away. Don't turn away from the living God, and don't refuse him who's speaking to you. Don't go back. See the danger. Now, in contrasting life under the old Mosaic covenant with life under the new covenant and the one that Jesus fulfills, not only does the letter show that the old covenant and the rituals, they're now obsolete in that they have been fulfilled in Christ. It also shows some of the continuity between the old and the new covenant. For example, continuity in terms of faith. So as these Jewish Christians, as they trust in Jesus, and as they keep trusting in Jesus, and as they persevere in trusting in Jesus, they are following in the footsteps of the great men and women of faith in the Old Testament. People like Abel and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Gideon and Barak and Samuel and David and so on. These were all looking forward in faith to Jesus. And these Jewish Christians, they are looking back in faith to Jesus. Recognizing that these Jewish Christians, they are in a much better position than their Old Testament heroes because they live the other side of the cross. Now, how is the letter structured? What is the letter structure? Well, this is not overly straightforward. People will present different structures, but I'll give you a kind of a big picture, basic outline, which is not perfect, but I hope will be helpful. So in chapter 1, verse 1, through to chapter 4 and verse 13, we're shown the superiority of Christ's person. And this is what we'll be studying over the next 3 months up until December. And in this section, we'll see that he's better than the Old Testament prophets, he's better than the angels, he's better than Moses, he's better than Joshua. Then in chapter 4, verse 14 through to chapter 10, verse 18, we're shown the superiority of Christ's work. And in that section, you'll see that he's better than the Old Testament priests. He's a mediator of a better covenant. He enters a better sanctuary, having made a better sacrifice. And then from chapter 10, verse 19, through to chapter 13 and verse 17, we're shown the superiority of the Christian's life of faith. Superior in that with the coming of Christ, New Testament believers are in a far better position than the Old Testament saints, having seen what they never saw. And then, of course, you have the conclusion at the end in chapter 13, verse 18 to 25. Now, what that structure doesn't show you is that there are at least 5 warning passages in the letter to the Hebrews. There are at least 5 warning passages in the letter to the Hebrews. So chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, don't drift away. Chapter 3, verse 7 to chapter 4, verse 10, don't harden your heart and don't fail to enter God's rest. Chapter 5, verse 11 to chapter 6, verse 12, don't fall away. Chapter 10, verse 26 to 31, don't continue in sin. Don't continue in rebellion against God. And then chapter 12, verse 25 to 29, don't refuse to listen to God. And that leads on to the question, what type of letter is it? What type of letter is it? Well, at the end of the letter, you will have noticed that the author describes it as an exhortation. So in chapter 13 and verse 22, he says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, bear with my word of exhortation. So this letter is an exhortation. He is both warning and encouraging. He is exhorting them. He is exhorting them, and he's exhorting them, he's warning them, and he's encouraging them to persevere and to not go back and to keep going to the finishing line. You'll be familiar with the picture in chapter 12 when he pictures them as a group of runners that are running together with him running with them. He's part of the group that is running, and he wants to encourage them, and he wants them to encourage each other. And so he keeps appealing to them. All the way through the letter, he keeps appealing to them. So, for example, he keeps saying, let us. This letter is very corporate. He keeps saying, let us. Let us, therefore, make every effort to enter that rest. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Let us then approach God's throne of grace. Let us move beyond the elementary teachings about Christ. Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. Let us consider how we may spur one another on. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably. Let us then go to him outside the camp. Let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise. He keeps saying, let us, let us, let us. It's a stirring read. And what you find is that the appeals, they build in momentum as the letter develops. So at the beginning of the letter, it's more argument than appeal. But then towards the end of the letter, there are more appeals than arguments. And so as we look forward to this new series in the letter to the Hebrews, I want us to finish this morning by thinking about you. Where are you in the Christian faith? How's it going? Where are you in the Christian race? Are you in the race? And maybe you're someone here this morning and you're not a Christian. And we're so glad that you are here this morning, but maybe you've never put your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ and you've not even entered the Christian race. Well, it's my prayer that as we go through this letter and we see the beauty and the wonder of Jesus and we see how sufficient Jesus is and we see that Jesus is better than anyone or anything else, my prayer is that you'll put your trust in Jesus and you will begin to run in the Christian race. That you'll start to believe in Jesus. And maybe you are in the race, but like these people, you are looking back. Apparently there was a very famous race between Roger Bannister and John Landy in the 1950s. Now, these two men, Roger Bannister and John Landy, at this point, they were the only two people who had run a mile in under 4 minutes, and they were both part of the same race. And John Landy, during the race, he was in the lead. But as he came to the final lap, he lost focus and concentration, and he looked behind him to see where Roger Bannister was, and right at that moment, Roger Bannister, he made the most of that opportunity and that loss of concentration, and he overtook him on the blind side, and he won the race. And I want to ask you, are you looking back? Are you looking behind you? And not to Judaism, but to your old way of life before you became a Christian. Are you tempted to return? Are you tempted to go back to living like you were before you were a Christian? Are you tempted to drop out of the race? If that's you, then my prayer for you is that as we go through this letter, that you will both receive the strong challenges and warnings of the eternal danger of doing that, and also that you will be motivated by the wonderful encouragements to continue in the race and to keep going, to not look back. Or it might be that you are in the race and you're not looking behind you, but you're not running as wholeheartedly as you could run. And you're not taking the race as seriously as you should be taking the race. And there are things in your life that are not necessarily wrong, but they're not helping you in the race. And there are sins which you are not putting to death in the way that you should do. And those sins, they are entangling you and they are tripping you up. And my prayer for you is that God will use this letter to make you laser focused in the race, to take the Christian life seriously, to be putting sin to death, and to be getting rid of all that is unhelpful in the Christian faith, and to be really going for it as a Christian. Or it might be that this morning you are running well, and you've got your eyes fixed on your Savior, the pioneer and the perfecter of your faith, and you are focused on him, and you are wholehearted in living for him, and you love the Lord Jesus Christ, and you are taking the Christian life so seriously, and your eyes are fixed on Jesus, and they are fixed on the finishing line of heaven, and you are looking forward to that day when you will be with him. And if that's you, then I hope that this letter will encourage you even more to be running as well as you can. And wherever you are in the race this morning, I hope that this letter, that it will help you to keep on going. And I hope that it will be a small part of what God uses in your life to make it. You need to make it. It is not enough just to start the race. What is essential is that you finish the race. And my prayer for you is that you will make it, that you'll make it home. And I trust that this letter is part of what God helps you to do that.